Good evening. My name is Mark Evanier. I'm a writer most of the time, but I'm becoming a webcaster here because during the pandemic, we all do a lot of odd things we never expected to do before. I have to turn my fan off here too. Welcome. Uh, Tonight we're going to be talking about magic. And I get to invite on here a gentleman who I love talking to about magic. About 40 years ago, I joined an institution called the Magic Castle, which many of you have heard of. It was a magical place. I'll tell the story of how I joined in a little bit, maybe. But one of the joys of it is that you get to see really, really wonderful magicians. And if you're lucky, you get to meet really wonderful magicians. And this gentleman qualifies in both categories. There are magicians who just amaze you. There are magicians who make you laugh. And either of those can be a very successful act. There are magicians who leave you with something to think about when you go home. And this guy checks all the boxes on this. I'd like you to meet my friend, Mr. Max Maven. Hello, Max.
Good evening.
Thank you, and welcome to. We got people watching us. I joined the castle in 1980, I believe. You went. How long have you been a member of the place?
I first came out. It was actually my first time ever visiting LA. In the very beginning of 1977, I came out and performed at the castle for a week. And by late 1978, I had moved to LA and was a member and very much involved.
Now, I'm going to tell the story of how I got interested in magic, and then you tell yours. When I was very young, I fell in love with a gentleman on TV named Paul Winchell, the world's best ventriloquist, and I said, I want to do that. And ventriloquism is kind of a very close cousin to magic. And it always struck me that in some cases, ventriloquism was a rarefied form of magic, because in magic, you are doing something impossible. You're convincing the audience that the person disappears, or they levitate, or they're sawed in half, and they don't know how it's done. In ventriloquism, you are convincing them that the puppet is alive and talking, even though they know how it's done.
Right.
In fact, almost every ventriloquist has in his act, in some place, the dummy turns to ventriloquist and says, hey, who's working your head? Or, hey, you can't talk while I'm talking, right, or something like that. They just give it away, and the audiences still pretend that they are actually seeing that. And right on the heels of that, I saw another magical person on television named Mark Wilson. I suspect that nobody inspired more magicians of my age, more people about magic, than Mark Wilson. Because for one thing, he was on TV an awful lot. He had his own Saturday morning show, and he was on every variety show for a while and appearing. He was hard to get away from him, in fact. And also, and this was a very major factor, he had a great-looking assistant and a wife.
The lovely Nani Darnell.
Yes. I took a magic course at the castle one time from Whit Hayden, who you know well, and who is a very fine magician, a guy who amazes you and makes you laugh too. And Nani, who still works with Mark a lot and things, she was in charge of taking the roll, of making sure everyone had paid for their lessons. She came in and just kind of read the roll off. And after she left, Whit turned to the audience, the class, which is all guys, roughly the same age, and said, okay, how many of you became magicians because you wanted to have a wife or an assistant that looked like her? And we all put our hands up. And that not only was attractive to us as guys, but it also took that little stigma, I'm going to use a word I hate, called nerd, away from magic. If you had a mate who looked like her, you were by definition not a nerd.
Fair enough.
Even though magic could make you trend that way at times. And I played around with things, and I did magic for a while, and I got interested in other things, and I never devoted the time to it that I would need to get really good. And I had no desire to be a professional and perform in front of audiences. When did you start on this trail?
I first encountered magic somewhere at the age of 7 or 8. I was, a couple of years later, I became a huge fan of Mark Wilson. I got to know Mark and Nani and their family. Paul Winchell, I was also a big fan, although I only met him once, and that was very late in the game. He was pushing 90, I think, when I met him, but it was thrilling to meet a childhood hero. I entered into magic initially. Surely I saw some magic on TV, but the first exposure I had directly to the idea that I might be able to do this was an older cousin showed me a couple of very simple card tricks. And about a month or two later, an uncle showed me a cut and restored string trick. And I was hooked. Possession of that secret information, it was classic addiction. I wanted more.
Did you want to be a performer?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
At what age did you think, hey, maybe I'll make my living doing this?
I actually didn't make that commitment until my mid-20s, because it wasn't until then that I realized I was allowed to. I come from a family where nobody was in show business. I always assumed when I went to university, it was not to prepare for a specific career. I didn't expect to go into medicine or some science or something.
Did you have one interest that if you had never gone into magic might have been your future?
Well, probably something involving a desk.
Moving it, building it, polishing it,
writing something with a creative output, writing, possibly graphic design. These were all things that I was interested in and that have been part of my work in the larger field of magic. I have written an awful lot for magic publications and books and such. In the old days, I used to put out little pamphlets of tricks that I'd invented and illustrated them using my graphic skills such as they were. So, but it never occurred to me that I could just declare I'm in show business until I was about 24. And suddenly I had this epiphany that I could try whatever I wanted to try. I was allowed.
But where did you first do this in front of paying people?
Oh, well, that I started earlier. I mean, I was doing children's birthday parties at the age of 12. Now, mind you, they didn't pay very much, nor was what I was doing worth very much. But the idea of performing in front of an audience where someone then handed me money, that started pretty early. And even, up to college and after college, I continued to do occasional performances. I was what is sometimes referred to as a semi-pro,
okay.
In that I was not basing my entire income or living on that, but it was part of my livelihood. And again, it was when I was about 24 that I took the plunge and said, "This is it. This is I'm in for the long haul."
Now, the act you were doing then was nothing like the act you do now, correct? Or was it?
No, I mean it was. I'd like to think it was nowhere near as good as it became.
But I mean, now you are basically a mentalist.
Yeah.
Your act is mostly about reading minds, psychic type of experiences and such. Was that the theme at that age?
It was. When I first encountered mentalism as a concept, I mean, I must have in early books which had mental magic tricks in them. But as far as the more sophisticated type of thing, I started becoming aware of that and reading that in my late teens. What is interesting, looking back, is that somehow I had the prescience to realize that I wasn't old enough to perform that material when still in my teens. So for a number of years, I read and studied mentalism, but I performed tricks and cloak magic and the like. And it wasn't until right around the time that I made the plunge into full-time performing that I felt I had gained enough age just to be an effective performer of that style of work. There are things in my repertoire that I have been doing at least versions of since the mid-70s. Okay. They aren't the same as they were back then, I have to emphatically add. They have grown. They have improved. I understand them better. I do them better, if you will. And they've been burnished over many, many years. But there's more similarity than not, I guess I could say.
Who are the magicians you looked up to as you were getting into the field? Who are the people who maybe were either role models or examples of the standards you were trying to achieve?
Well, some of my early heroes were people like Don Allen.
Don Allen was a name I was just going to mention. All right.
Don, who I later got to know, really redefined what is referred to as close-up magic, which is the intimate stuff usually done sitting around a table. And Don was really a game changer in that. He wasn't the first close-up magician, but he suddenly set the example that almost everyone modeled themselves after for the next several decades. Jay Marshall, who became a good friend, and Jay was a remarkable performer because he was very droll, very charming, very witty, and yet he could be silly when he wanted to be. And just about everything he did came out of his pockets. But it was stand-up. I mean, he worked the Palladium. He worked the Palace. He worked the Ed Sullivan Show 14 times. So he knew how to work a large audience, but did not depend on big props to do it. Now, if that sounds like I'm disparaging big props, far be it. One of the greatest magicians I ever saw and got to see numerous times because I wanted to so much was Ricciardi Jr., just a magnificent illusionist, originally from Peru, but who worked the world. But I didn't get to see him until I was in my middle to late 20s. But you're asking for early influences. I'll tell you who influenced me tremendously. I only saw him perform live once, and there isn't that much video of him. But Roy Benson, who was another stand-up droll comedian, working mostly with relatively small props. I saw him live when I was probably 15 or 16, and I just thought he was so witty and charming and urbane, and the magic was, for the most part, terrific. There were a couple of throwaway gags, but when he actually set out to do magic, he would fool you. It was powerful stuff, but not delivered with the sort of heavy-handed way that we think of many performers, and I suppose some people would think of me.
Well, now I gave you a blank stare on his name because I don't really recognize that.
Well, I believe there are some recordings of Roy Benson on YouTube. I haven't checked recently. Again, there aren't that many recordings. There are only about 4 or 5 that exist. He came up in the New York area, published a certain amount of stuff. There's one huge book about him published by a fellow named Todd Carr, who puts out wonderful books for magicians, but beautifully produced and very thoroughly researched. And a lot of what Benson did has filtered into the repertoires of many magicians, some of whom don't even know that they're doing a piece of Benson's or that they're doing something derived from Benson. If we really want to talk about Benson, we have to actually go back to the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century, and a fellow whose name I'm guessing you know, Frank Fay.
Yes.
Frank Fay whose name is essentially lost now, was the man who invented stand-up comedy as we know it.
Yeah.
He just changed everything. And his style became the style. Without Frank Fay, you get no Jack Benny.
Yes. Jack Benny was once talked about his admiration for Fay, and somebody said, "How can you admire that horrible man who beat his wife?" And he said, "I don't care about that part. I like the way he delivers a joke."
Well, yeah, I mean, nobody liked Frank Fay. On a personal level, he was pretty much reviled. And it's pretty clear he was not a good human being, but he was a brilliant comic.
He made his Broadway comeback in Harvey, I believe.
Yes. Yep.
Play Harvey on Broadway,
We're sure his career was over. I'll tell you a quick anecdote about Frank Fay. even though that's not our topic this evening, but this is just too good a story, and you of all people will, I think, appreciate it. Frank Fay, you know the movie A Star Is Born, the original ones. It's been done 4 or 5 times. That's actually based on Frank Fay. If you recall, A Star Is Born in its earlier incarnations is about a famous actor who meets a young woman who's just trying to break into the business. And they wind up getting married, and as her star ascends, his declines until, as an alcoholic wreck, having kind of ruined his career, in order to not destroy her career, he has the nobility to walk into the ocean and kill himself. That's A Star Is Born. That's the story of Frank Fay, except he didn't have the nobility to kill himself. The young woman that he met and married, much younger than he, was a dancer with some minor Broadway credits named Ruby Stevens. And when they moved to Hollywood, he was the one with the contract with Warner Brothers. She managed to wangle a reading, an audition for Daryl Zanuck, and she was so nervous she blew the audition. Frank Fay called Zanuck and used his influence to get her another reading. She came back, and this time the reading went well, and she got booked. She also changed her name to Barbara Stanwyck, and she became the highest paid woman in the world for several years. And Frank Fay's career in movies never took off. He was never particularly suited to the medium. So she became a huge star, and he was out of work and drinking heavily. And then in the 1940s, he stopped drinking alcohol. He switched to drinking coffee, drinking 75 Demi-Tasse cups a day. Demi-Tasse are the small ones, but even so, we're looking at easily 35, 40 cups of coffee a day. And he got back into the business. But in between then and Harvey, which brought him back into the limelight, Frank Fay was sort of reduced to much smaller gigs, much below the level he'd had when he was known as Broadway's favorite son. And he got a gig at a club here in LA called the Macambo on Sunset Boulevard. And they hired him one night a week, probably a Monday, to MC a talent contest. And on opening night of this talent contest, the club was packed, mostly with celebrities who were attending to see the mighty Frank Fay reduced to this. And early in the show, someone in the audience yelled out a line, heckling Frank Fay. And Frank Fay looked up and saw who it was and said, "Oh, it's you. Well, why don't you come down here and we'll have some fun?" And the heckler demurred. So who was the heckler who was afraid to go one-on-one with Frank Fay? Groucho Marx. And when Groucho backed off, Frank Fay smiled in a smile that was described in one account as being shark-like and said, "Oh, you do need Zeppo, don't you?" So back to magic. Frank Fay changed the course of comedy. Johnny Carson once said to Jack Benny, he said, "I feel guilty because I've taken everything from you, all my timing, my style, my rhythm, and my delivery." And Jack Benny said, "Don't feel bad about it. I took it all from Frank Fay." Well, a lot of people did. And in magic, the first person to kind of crack the code and figure out what Frank Fay was doing was a fellow named Fred Keating, whose name is lost now. I mean, most performers and magicians don't even know the name of Fred Keating, but Keating was a skillful magician, but who adapted this urbane and droll style. Keating became the second most frequently booked MC in the Palace Theater in New York, the pinnacle of vaudeville. The most booked was Frank Fay, but Keating did very, very well in that. He also made a bunch of movies, not great. A few of them he's great because he was clearly able to be directed. Anyway, when Keating broke into this mold, the next one in was Roy Benson, who did not steal Keating's material, but adopted the same Frank Fay style. And Keating is said to have growled upon seeing Benson performing, "That son of a bitch stole my act." But he didn't. He was mimicking the same source as Keating. I never saw Keating. He died when I was a child, but I saw Roy Benson, and that had more impact on me, that one performance, than maybe any other person in the field of magic.
Really? Okay. In our chat room, Holly Buchanan tells us, yes, there are Roy Benson clips on YouTube.
Terrific.
And Richard Gersh tells us Frank Fay can be seen in an early color talkie, the show of shows on TCM and YouTube clips.
Absolutely true.
Yes.
If you want to see what Frank Fay was about, however, in the show of shows, it all feels very dated. It is very much pieces from his live act, but it doesn't hold up all that well unless you're very forgiving about the changes of time and culture. But what does hold up well is a later movie called Nothing Sacred, in which it's Carol Lombard and Frederick March. Is that right? I think so.
It's Carol Lombard,
and
yes.
The premise is that Carol Lombard thinks she's got a terminal disease, and a newspaper in New York finds this young woman in the sticks with this terminal disease and decides to give her a few days of wonderful excitement in New York before. It's like Make-A-Wish.
This was remade with Jerry Lewis many years later.
You're right.
That's right. Yeah.
Anyway, in the course of this, where Frederick March, as this sort of hard-boiled newspaper reporter, is tasked with taking Carol Lombard around New York, they go to a nightclub, and there's an absurd scene in a nightclub where there are these beautiful statuesque women who come out wearing ludicrous fashion, each based on an ethnic stereotype. So there's a woman dressed representing Indians, and she's wearing a big feathered headdress and riding a horse. And the next woman represents Bavaria, Germany, and she's got giant pretzels over her breasts and holding giant steins of beer. So it's a silly production number of the type that years later Don Arden would do in Las Vegas.
The one with the pretzels got to work again in The Producers.
Yes, yeah. You're right. Well, in this scene, the MC of this show, making just short of lascivious remarks about these women, is Frank Fay in White Tie and Tails. He's only in the movie for 9 minutes, but he's really good. And in that tiny little compressed time, you see his timing and his attitude, and I think from that you can understand why this guy was so good, especially when you realize that he pretty much invented this form without a model.
I actually one time talked about Frank Fay with Milton Berle, who had that same love-hate relationship with him.
Yes, I hit him in the face
with a scene flap, like a scene brace or something like that. Berle bragged about that. He was one of the very proud of that. Because what else has Milton Berle got to be proud of? Anyway, anyway, it's interesting we got in the subject here because I wanted to talk about the parallels between magician performing and stand-up comedy, but we'll get to that.
Okay.
I'm going to leave back up here. The two guys who I kind of were fascinated by growing up, magicians. One was Don Allen. He did a show called Magic Ranch.
Yes, he did.
Which was syndicated on Channel 9, ran it here. And he was the first guy, the first magician I was ever really aware of who would take his time with a trick. Yeah. Because with him, he would take a trick which somebody else might do in 90 seconds, and he would make 6 minutes out of it with the patter, and he always had a great punchline.
Yes, he did.
There was always there was usually a verbal punchline that coincided with the reveal of
unbelievable finish. Yes,
the finish.
Yeah. Don was terrific. I'll tell you something interesting that you and the viewers can look for if you see any video of Don. There are some kinescopes from that Magic Ranch series around, not all of them, but more than a couple. And whenever he's about to perform a routine, he's talking to the viewer at home, and he gathers usually about 3 people around him with the television camera, and thus you being sort of the additional spectator. And then he goes into the routine, and every time he does, if you're paying attention, you'll notice the pitch of his voice goes up. Every time he starts into an actual formal routine, the pitch of his voice goes up because it's just a little bit cuter. And he's all about bonding. He's all about, being friendly and not flirty in any actual sexual way, but flirty in almost a comic strip way.
Yeah. Well, to the extent that I performed magic, Don was kind of my performing hero. And I'll tell quickly here the story. I wanted to go to the Magic Castle for years. I kept hearing about it. I didn't have any access. I didn't know anyone who could get me in. And when I was doing variety shows for Sid and Marty Krofft, we had a dancer on the show I started dating, a very cute girl named Bridget, who was 5'1" and very wonderful and terrific. And one day she said to me, "I'm working at the Magic Castle next week." And I said, "What?" She said, "I'm a magician's assistant. And would you like to come up and see me be sawed in half?" And I, of course, said yes, after doing the joke about getting the half that eats. And she was working as an assistant to the other hero I had when I was growing up, who was Chuck Jones.
Oh,
Chuck Jones, no relation to the guy who did the Roadrunner cartoons.
No, but a significant figure nevertheless.
Yeah. Chuck was on Channel 13
with us, just like Mark. I mean, Mark and Chuck are two of the old guard classical illusionists out there.
Chuck was on Channel 13 in Los Angeles with a show that I think was done for about $11 a week. He had no budget. It was just him, and he would do magic tricks, and each day he would teach you a trick that you could do, and you'd hope your friends weren't watching Channel 13 so you could do the trick for them. And I got all excited because here's my chance to go to the Magic Castle, and I have an in to meet Chuck Jones. Now, this was 1980. Chuck Jones is still playing the Magic Castle when there's a Magic Castle. He's still working.
He's still out there, yes.
So wonderful. And I got to meet him that night, and I became aware of one thing I didn't want to do if I ever got into magic: big box tricks. I discovered that I learned that night that magicians who do big box tricks spend their lives dealing with shipping and repairs.
Yep.
And he was dealing, and every time I've ever seen Chuck at the castle, he is dealing with the problem of transporting his act to some other city, and it got damaged on the way. He has to make a repair on the spot. And
I'm going to interrupt you just long enough to say that your voice is a little bit choppy.
How's that? Is that better now? Does that got me better? Thank you. Okay. This headset is not perfect here. Anyway. But
yes, I mean, Chuck and the folks who do the big stuff, they get to use the title of Grand Illusion as sort of the category, which sounds great, but it also means that for much of the time you're a furniture mover. You're just packing stuff into huge crates and boxes and loading it up and driving to the next town. It looks glamorous, but as Carol Roy, who was the wife of Marvin Roy, who just passed away a few months ago, but Carol, when she was still around, she actually used to write a column for Genie magazine, which is a magician's trade journal, and the title of the column was "It Ain't All Glamour." And that's a very true thing.
Yeah. Anyway, I saw backstage exactly what Chuck was going through trying to fix props and things like that. And apparently he's still doing that. He's still
out there. And a creative, clever guy. I don't want to not give him his due. Partly, I think, because of this background of doing a television show where he had to keep coming up with new stuff because he was getting the same kids watching all the time. He became very prolific and creative, and there are things that Chuck has created that have gone on to become standards. Uh, although unlike with Benson, I think Chuck's name has held on better in part because his name is connected to physical props, and Benson is more for routining. It's a little more ephemeral.
Yeah. Anyway, shortly after that, I got a job on the TV show That's Incredible for a while, and I began going to the castle and taking my dues off as a business expense because I was booking magicians, and I put Richard Turner on That's Incredible for his first television exposure, and a few other guys. And at one point, the producer said to me, I want to get a classic close-up guy in. Who's a good one? I said, Don Allen.
Yep.
And they brought Don Allen in. I got to spend 2 days with him. And I still do a couple of tricks that he taught me that were quite wonderful. Oh, you know who's online right now? Our friend Bill Kirkenbauer is online.
Wow, I have not seen Bill in ages.
Yes.
Oh,
Hi,
nice
Bill.
to see you.
Yeah. I've known Bill for a long time.
Bill and I were on an episode of Mork and Mindy together.
Wow. Okay.
Just before the Battle of Gettysburg.
Well, I did one of these interviews with Bill a couple of weeks ago, which is still online. It was very fun. Bill and I go way back also. Yes. Bill is saying yes. Hey guys, things like that. Ooh, yeah, he's scary too.
He's quoting me. That's my opening line.
So anyway, I just found I was just entranced with the cat. I joined almost immediately after that evening when I got up there, and turned down the life membership fee then, which was one of the stupider things I ever did, because I thought, well, because at that point there were all these rumors the castle wouldn't be around long, and there's always been rumors the castle's not going to be around long, and when I suddenly realized I should have bought the life membership, they stopped offering it. Anyway, I was amazed to see, because of the castle, the studiousness, the camaraderie, the magicians helping each other, the respect for one another. I was very pleased by it too, but I had never really understood the networking that went on and how magicians. I'm sure there's magicians you never got along with, but it seemed like there was.
To be genuinely honest, not that many. I've had fallings out, but for the most part, magicians are a pretty friendly subculture. And that's always been the case. I think part of that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of shared secrets once you're on the inside, as it were. And that creates a bonding. There are a lot of magicians who I've known over my lifetime where I didn't know what they did in the real world. Someone may have been a judge or the head of a major corporation or a broom pusher. But in the context of, can you do good card tricks or can you make a coin disappear? All of that sort of fell by the wayside. And I think that's still the case today in many respects. So there is a kind of camaraderie among magicians that I think is more present than in a lot of other subdivisions of show business. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna here. Magic has its sociological issues and problems. But I think overall, the network is good. It used to be, in the days before the internet, it was a fairly common thing that someone who was traveling, let's say you had business that took you to Cleveland, and you were an amateur magician. You could pick up the yellow pages, turn to the M section, look up magicians, and find out, who in town was advertising either as a magic shop or for doing magic shows, and just call them up. And likely as not, you'd be invited to their home for dinner or to go out for coffee to schmooze or what have you. This was really typical in the pre-internet days.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I
anyway,
don't think that happened among ice skaters. I could be wrong.
Well, maybe not. One of the parallels I found between magic and stand-up comedy I want to talk about here. There are in in magic, as in comedy, in magic there are tricks that belong to no one.
Yes.
Nobody owns the linking rings, nobody owns matrix, nobody owns some of these other tricks.
Right.
And they're done by lots of different people. And
Yes.
in comedy, there are routines and jokes that are owned by no one. There's just certain things that are like public domain and everybody uses them and they do their variations and such. And early on in my experience at the castle, there was a moment, and I can't even tell you who the guys were. There were two magicians who were arguing over a trick. And one of them claimed that was his trick, and the other one claimed, no, this is a common trick. Lots of people do this trick. And they went back, going back and forth. It was a semi-friendly debate, but you could tell people were getting a little pissed during it.
Yep.
And finally, the decision was, let's ask Max. You were going to be the Judge Wapner who was going to settle this.
Okay.
And you've done this, I know, many times for people.
I have been put in this position, yes.
They put you in this position. Well, I have been in this position with regards to comedy. Frequently, I identify with it because people have sometimes had these arguments over certain jokes and certain bits of routines, and someone says that's mine, and they go, no, that goes way back. And so anyway, so I identify with that, and I was impressed with how both guys said, okay, whatever Max says goes. And they came to you, and you knew some guy who'd done that bit in the 14th century and whatever it was, or you identified the province, I think was the term.
I'm reasonably well versed in magic history.
Okay.
And people do come to me with some frequency these days, obviously by email, but saying, do you know where this idea comes from? Frequently be someone who's come up with something and says, have I reinvented the wheel? Has this been done before? So I wind up sometimes being put into the position of delivering unfortunate news to someone that their exciting new idea has been around a few lifetimes before them.
Okay, I know that feeling. How often do you see a new magician or any magician perform and you have no idea how it's done?
Wow. Let me start the answer by saying absolutely I can be fooled. If there's any human being who makes the proclamation, I can't be fooled by a magic performance, they're either delusional or they're lying. Anyone can be fooled, even really smart people, even really well-versed students of magic. Having said that, because I've now been studying magic for about 62 years, I know a lot. And I am fooled much less often than I would like to be. I love being fooled. I love seeing something and saying, I don't get it. This just feels like magic. I absolutely love that. I won't say that happens frequently, but when it does, I embrace it. And I'm not going to run out and try and solve it or compare notes with friends. There's a fellow originally from Colorado, now in New York. He lived in LA for quite a while, named Derek Delgaudio. And Derek has a show called In and of Itself, which had a successful run at the Geffen out here, and then moved to a theater in New York for over a year, kept getting extended, got phenomenal reviews, became a very sought after ticket, and it wasn't physically that large a theater, so it began selling out consistently. I got to see that show 4 times, and there's stuff in that show I still don't know how it works. And I like Derek. I would never be so crass as to say, "Hey, Derek, how'd you do that particular sequence?" But even if I did, I think he would be. I think he has enough self-respect that he would, instead of saying, "Well, I'll let you in on it," he would say, "I don't want to talk about it," and he'd be right. So it would not be truthful to say that he fools me with every single moment in that show, but a pretty big number of moments. There's an awful lot of stuff in that show that is just, to me, great magic. And I love it when that happens.
It is being suggested by Holly Buchanan, Max and Teller Fool Us would be a brutal show.
Oh, well, actually, there's actually some history sort of like that. When Penn and Teller debuted that show originally in England. It was a series, and it did well enough that it eventually got picked up in the US in the version they're doing now. At some point in between the two, the concept for the show was purchased by an Israeli television production team. And it was legit. I mean, they didn't copy the show. They actually paid someone the money for the creative concept. And now they needed someone to be the judge or judges. And Penn and Teller are very expensive. And at that time, at least, nobody in Israel knew who they were. So it wasn't worth the money to bring them over to do Penn and Teller Fool Us. So they started looking around and asking around who could do this, who wouldn't cost as much as Penn and Teller, but who would be a good person. And my name kept coming up. So eventually the head producer was in LA. We had dinner, and by the end of the meal, I had a gig. And I went to Israel, and this is about 8 years ago. I went to Israel and we shot the show. It was 8 episodes. The title of the show was changed. I can't tell you the Hebrew title off the top of my head, but it translated to Who Can Fool the Master, with my picture in the logo, just in case there was any question as to who the master was. And so instead of being 2 guys sitting in big chairs, it was just me. And it was fun to do.
How often were you fooled?
Enough times. This is long enough ago that I can't tell you the exact number. But
okay, were you ever fooled?
What I tried to do with each of the performers before saying whether I've been fooled, or at least some of it had fooled me, I always tried to give some historical background. Now, this was done legitimately in that I didn't have a chance to go Google anything. I was seeing these routines performed for the very first time as the audience in the studio saw them, and then as later was shown on TV. So from just seeing that, I had to be able to say, well, you know, the basic thing you're doing actually goes back to the 1920s. And here's the name of the guy who put this on the map. But what you're doing is interesting because, and kind of trying to put it together in an almost academic way. And I was able to do that more often than not. So people seem to like that aspect of the show when I did it.
Okay. Now, when you were fooled, after the show, you'd find out how they did it, presumably, or not.
Not always.
Okay. Did you ever, after the show, somebody go, "Oh, how could I be so dumb"?
No, but you bring up a point that leads to there's a kind of classic statement that is used by magicians when talking to non-magicians, who magicians refer to as lay people. And it's not infrequent that a layperson says to a magician, "Oh, come on, just tell me how that particular trick works." And a very common response is, "If I told you, you'd be disappointed." And I think that's a terrible statement because I don't think it's true. My corollary to that is, if you were fooled by a trick and then the explanation disappoints you, it means you didn't fully understand the method. Because something about that method was wonderful enough to fool you. And the fact that it may have been something rudimentary or simple or something obvious that somehow you were steered away from guessing, or whatever it may be, if a piece of magic fools you, and let's get away from that word because that's kind of in the puzzle realm. Let's just say it amazes you. It gives you an experience of mystery. Then whatever the method was, it shouldn't be disappointing. It might be disappointing that the method is very expensive or very labor intensive or requires things that are morally questionable. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons that you could be disappointed, but not the way it's used in that statement of if you knew the secret, you'd be disappointed.
Okay. How often when you have been fooled, is it because of new technologies?
Surprisingly rare. Magicians historically have been very early adapters when it comes to technology. The whole history of film and its predecessors, before film, there was the magic lantern, which by its title suggests that magicians were using it. This was today we would just say it was a slide projector, but these were elaborate slides on glass, some of which had gimmicks so that things could move or change as the image was projected. This led to something called phantasmagoria, which was a whole sort of ghost show of projections, and a number of amazing optical principles, which eventually evolved into film. And magicians such as Georges Méliès were among the very first to jump into film. Méliès is considered the father of special effects, and that's because he was a magician. He was a stage magician who, when he discovered this new medium, started finding ways to use the medium to create impossible moments on the screen. So over the years, many magicians have found new technologies. Without going into too much detail, secret use of radios in magic go back centuries. I mean, at the very beginning of what we would now call radio, magicians are right there, and other technologies as well. I don't think too much is being done with technology today, partly because the rate at which new technology shows up makes it very difficult for a magician to get ahead of the curve, because we're all finding out these extraordinary new devices kind of as they happen. And a lot of the stuff that really fools people fools them not because it's cutting edge technology, but because it's exactly the opposite. It's an idea that may be hundreds of years old, but presented in such a way that the audience just throws their hands up and says, this is real magic.
Okay. Now, how often when you are watching let me say I can phrase this. There's times when I see a magician perform and I know how they did it, and I'm more impressed than if I didn't know how they did it, because I realized the skill that went into. I remember talking to Sean Farquhar one time, and we were talking about a magician. I can't remember who he was talking about. He said, the guy fooled me because I didn't realize anyone could do a bottom deal that well. I didn't realize the guy was so good at that, and I had eliminated that as a possibility.
Right,
and well, that was the truth. The guy had learned this so well.
In various different phrasings that part of what makes the art of magic become magical is by concealing the skill. And so there are people who do remarkably difficult things and pass it off as if they didn't do anything. And the result is that the audience is impressed. But there are times in conversation that a magician will say to another magician something along the lines of, if they only knew what was really going on. There's an entire show happening that most of the audience isn't aware of at all. I have used the comment about certain pieces of magic regarding audiences, and sometimes including magician audiences, of saying that audience knew it was fooled. They didn't realize how badly they were fooled. They were fooled even beyond what they perceived. So there are different layers in creating magic. And I think if you're going to be a good magician, you have to kind of make a choice. There are a couple of types of magic where the audience is allowed to see your skill. A perfect example of that would be someone who does a gambling demonstration. Derek El Gaudio does a very good gambling demonstration in his show. It's phenomenally good and skilled, and it's probably the least impressive thing in his show. But there are other folks. You mentioned Richard Turner, whose act is largely built around the idea that he says to you, I'm going to use skill and sleight of hand to control the cards as they are dealt. The fellow who's currently doing the show online, tied into the Geffen, Helder Guiramesh, uses some gambling themes in his repertoire, which is being done on Zoom. And by no means all, but some of the stuff that he does, you are meant to say, oh my God, I don't know exactly how the physical skill is happening to control cards and make the right cards come about, but there's real skill there. And then there are other magicians who are trying to go in the opposite direction. And I'm not saying one is better than the other. What I'm hoping for with my own work, and I'm speaking only for myself, I want the audience to say after my show, well, I'd like to say lots of nice things, but one of the things I would like them to say is, but it was sort of like he didn't do anything. All these amazing things happened, but he didn't do anything that suggested he was physically causing them to happen. I mean, he was standing far away from things. And yet, I have this certainty that if he left the room, none of it would have happened. So I'm so divorced from any sense of method. I just have to say he's responsible for creating mystery, and I have no idea how. That's what I'm going for. Whether I achieve that or not depends.
Well, I think you do. I mean, I've seen you about 15 times, maybe 20 times. I came when you were doing the Steve Allen Theater. I came down to see you there and such. And what I was impressed by was the totality of the experience. The whole show was themed. There was no trick out of the ordinary. I mean, I don't mean out of the ordinary. They all fit into the theme. They were all interesting tricks, but you didn't just all of a sudden break into somebody else's act.
That show that you're referring to was a show that I created around 2004, although it has roots in an earlier show that I had done in 1988. It was a full evening theater show, 2 hours long with an intermission. The full title of the show was Max Maven, Thinking in Person, An Evening of Knowing and Not Knowing. And it was 2 hours long, but it wasn't all mentalism. The mentalism was integrated with monologues and stories about people and things that influenced the way I developed into me. And so everything sort of fit together. And at the beginning of the show, things that may have seemed separate, by the end of the show, by the end of the last moments of the second act, everything was watertight, or at least that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, I remember being very impressed by that show. I was impressed by it. I can't tell you the details of it. You had one volunteer who didn't know how to follow directions and who ruined your trick, and you recovered.
Could have been one of many shows.
You recovered from it. You had, I don't know if you had planned multiple outs or if you just quickly covered it up or something. But the guy, I think you'd asked this guy to pick one of 4 cards, and he picked the 5th one, and whatever it was, he just didn't understand.
Every routine in my repertoire can go wrong and has gone wrong. Years ago in the 80s, I actually kind of sat down and went through my active repertoire, which is not simply what's in that show, but material I do for all sorts of other situations. And I looked at my active repertoire, the stuff that I do most often, and I took out everything that didn't have at least some element of risk. Because I said, if there's no risk, there's no fun. For me.
Yeah, well,
it's sort of the Carl Wallenda school of entertainment, except that when I fall down, all that gets injured is my pride.
Well, my friend Carolyn, who you knew, my late friend Carolyn, when I took her to the castle, she always got picked as a volunteer, whether she liked it or not. And she was a very bright woman, but she had an inability to remember cards. So if she was picking a card, she would try to flash it to me so that
backup.
Yeah, and one time the magician told her, now pick the card, don't let anybody else see it, you're the only one in the room who knows it, and then put it back on the deck, and she completely forgot what the card was. And I saw the magician, when she said, I don't remember it, there was a little twinkle in his eyes, like it was the same look that I've seen a stand-up comedian have when there's a good heckler there. Oh, a challenge. And he started just doing another trick. I think he just seamlessly made it into another trick. And at
the start of this conversation, you mentioned that one of the topics we might be talking about is the relationship between stand-up comedy and magic.
Yeah.
And this kind of speaks to what you're talking about, the twinkle in that guy's eye. There are obviously many different types of magic, and there are many different types of comedy. So I'm not talking about all comedy or all magic, but there is a place where the Venn diagram of comedy and magic really intersect. And that has to do with people who are working not specifically in mentalism, but in the type of work that involves audience participation, whether from a stage or in a nightclub or at a close-up table, and where the audience can sometimes either make a comment or just screw something up, whether deliberately or by accident. And similarly, there are comics who'll go through a monologue that never changes, you know, and they just are delivering the lines, sometimes expertly. But there are comics who will see someone react and say, well, what do you do for a living? Or something, or it might be a heckler. And there's where the overlap really happens. Improv in a team is sort of a self-contained bubble most of the time. So you're working with teammates who know how to catch what you throw, as it were. You know, yes, and. But improv in the type of work that I do and the type of work that certain stand-up comics do is being in the moment, because the person you're interacting with is not part of your team. They may, in fact, be your adversary, or they may be trying to be helpful, but they just forgot the card, which is not the end of the world, but you have to deal with it. If you don't deal with it, everything falls apart. So being in the moment and saying, I mean, I love your story without knowing who the magician was, but that when she said she'd forgotten his card and that his eyes lit up, as you describe it, that feels like a fellow traveler to me, because he was saying, okay, instead of saying everything's ruined, he was saying, how can we make this into something? Where can we go with this?
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, certain types of comedians and certain types of magicians or mentalists are sharing very much the same territory.
One time I went to the castle. This is some time ago on a Monday night with a bunch of my friends, and it was back when the castle was empty on Monday nights, and they had let in a Japanese tour group, and we went to the palace show, and it was my party of about 6 people, and everybody else in the room was from the Japanese tour group, and the host, the MC host, was a guy I'm sure you know, Greg Otto.
Oh, sure.
And Greg came out and he looked at the audience and he said, I knew I was in trouble when the cloakroom told me they had checked 300 cameras. And we were the only ones who laughed, and he realized these people did not speak English. And his act depended on a lot of that. And with all due respect to you, I was able to read his mind.
Yeah.
Because I could tell that what he decided was, let's see how messy I can make this. Let's see how far I can drive this into the ground. When he needed a volunteer, he didn't pick one of us. He called up the person in the audience who looked least likely to speak English. And he just, it was like an exercise in, I'm going to make this the worst night of my life on stage and see what I can do with it. And he built, I was hysterical. It was very brilliant.
Well,
you know,
I'm, to the best of my knowledge, given that a couple of key players have passed away, I think I can now make the statement that I have worked more different parts of the world than any other talking variety act who is currently alive and in the business. And in some of those places, I work in the local language. I have and can perform in Japanese, for example. In some places, I can make do with some key words and phrases. And in some places, I need full translation. And obviously, that means you have to adjust your timing and your rhythms and your choice of material. But I've had the chance to work for audiences who don't know English. I had a fun experience. This would have been about 23 years ago. There used to be a place in Las Vegas called Caesar's Magical Empire.
I remember that.
There. It was an extraordinary place. It never did the right kind of business because they never knew how to promote it. But it was sort of the Magic Castle on steroids. It was beautifully rendered, huge. This underground set of catacombs, part of which looked to be ancient Egypt, parts looked to be ancient Persia, parts looked to be ancient China, with magic shows and dining and all the rest. And their main performance room was called the Sultan's Palace. And it was normally a 30-minute show in the Sultan's Palace, a 5-minute sort of production opening followed by 25 minutes. And the 25 minutes was normally done by illusionists, someone with big boxes and several assistants. It was all visual. And I wound up getting booked to headline that room for 4 weeks. And the predictions were dire. People said, Max Maven's going to die in that room because so many of the members of that audience come from other countries and don't speak English. And Max is all about speaking English. To which my reply was, someone had to know enough English to buy the tickets. So there's one person in every group who can keep the others up to date with what I'm saying, and the rest of it through just the rhythm, intonation, and timing will make it clear. And it did, it worked. I got terrific reactions, and it was a good 4 weeks. One of the nicest reviews I've ever had in my life, and I've had hundreds. In 1985, I did an international magic convention called FISM, which is the biggest international gathering of magicians. It happens every 3 years. And the first one I ever did was in '85, and it was in Madrid, Spain. And I performed, and I did a set that was not that long, 10 minutes or something. And the whole convention was reviewed by a guy whose name was Pierre Brama, who was a French magician, a manipulator, which is to say all sleight of hand with jewels and coins as a stage act. He had actually won the Grand Prix at a previous FISM. So he knew a lot about international magic and FISM. And when it got to my set, he had never seen me work before. He knew who I was, but he wrote a glowing review about my manner on stage, my presence, my timing, my interaction with spectators. Pierre Brama was completely deaf. So forget about the fact that his primary language was French and his English was minimal. He literally couldn't hear. And he wrote a glowing review, and it wasn't made up. I mean, he didn't say to his friends, was this guy any good? He was experiencing this very verbal act without the benefit of hearing what was going on. And he was able to follow the general narrative of what was happening, and he understood the timing, and he really liked the act.
That is a great review. Yeah.
So that, combined with the fact that I have had blind audience members who have told me how much they enjoyed the show, tells me that I can work for almost anyone.
Do you find that in different countries, leaving aside any language problem, the people react? Do you do a different acts other places in other countries?
Well, there are some differences. First of all, because there are things that require more linguistic subtlety than I can get for example, in a situation where I'm working with full translation. So that can affect things. The differences in audiences keep getting less, and that is because of the internet and how many American movies and television shows are seen all over the world. And that's happened within the United States too. There used to be very dependable differences in the audiences, let's say in the Deep South, as opposed to audiences in the Northeast or in the Midwest. The timing had to be adjusted to match those audience rhythms. And that's not completely gone, but it's more gone than not, because everybody has been seeing the same movies and TV shows. And so it's been kind of merging, and not as completely, but to a significant degree, that's true around the world. The cultural reference points are much more the same. Now, you'd be foolish to think that they're exactly the same. They're not. But the rhythms and the behavior, those have increasingly become similar. I'll tell you one place where there's a noticeable difference, although it's in the process of changing, is mainland China. In mainland China, applause is relatively new. And so what I have discovered in the times that I've worked in China, and it took me some days, the first time I did shows in China, I was a little thrown off for a few days until I kind of figured it out. The applause is very good in China, but it drops off very fast. So whereas you're sort of attuned to the idea that the audience is going to applaud at a certain level, and then it's going to take a while for the applause to fade out and for you to now kind of overlap that by starting the next thing. In China, the applause is very warm, very strong, and then it just stops. It drops very surprisingly quickly. And at first, when you experience that, it's hard not to think, oh, they didn't really like it. This is not an approval. And then you begin to understand, no, they just don't have a social history of extending applause. And so they don't. Right. So there are some differences like that in different parts of the world. There are places where the rhythms need to be a little slower or a little faster. But again, those differences are diminishing even as we speak because of this medium we're on, because the internet brings so much of the same entertainment experience around the world.
Okay. In Israel, do you have to read minds from right to left?
Ha!
Oh, all right. Never mind. I'm sorry.
Oh, good question.
I want to jump back. We jumped way past something here I wanted to talk about. Okay. Do you know how Penn and Teller Fool Us got picked up in the United States? Do you know the story of this? Because I do.
I don't know the full story. I mean, I know that the first thing that happened was the existing series from England was purchased or
okay, I've got a story for you then. Good. Okay. I was developing a game show for the CW network, and meeting with the people over there, and they said to me, "Who would you want to have host this?" And I mentioned a friend of mine in England named Jonathan Ross, who was what they call a presenter over there, talk show host. People call him the David Letterman of Great Britain sometimes. And the people I was talking to the CW went, "Who's that?"
Going.
Okay. And I said, "Well, you can see him. There's whatever number they did, 8 episodes of Fool Us for British television. They're all on YouTube." So they watched them and they called me up and they said, "He's very good. And that's a very interesting show. Do you think we could get the rights to that show and run that show in America?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. I don't know why not." So they bought the rights, ran them. They got great ratings, and they commissioned new shows in lieu of my show.
We're in Claire Booth Loose territory. No good deed goes unpunished.
Yes. A couple of years ago, I took my friend Amber to Las Vegas, and we went to see Penn and Teller. Somebody CW arranged for us to go see Penn and Teller and to go backstage and meet them first. And I took along my friend Frank Ferranti and his lady friend Drya, and we went backstage, and since Penn plays stand-up bass before the show, we met with Teller for a while and talked to him, and he and I got into a discussion which I want to extend to you in a minute about editing on magic on TV. Right. But we got a very interesting discussion about that, and then I said, the story. I'm supposed to tell you the story of how your show got bought for American TV. What I had to do, but we were waiting for Penn to come in, and Penn comes in, and he was with us for about a minute and a half. I think he just, what's the story? Okay, thank you, goodbye. he was very disinterested in it, but that's how that show got picked up. And the funny thing is that when as we walked in to see, we went backstage. This is before the show. And as they took us into this place called the Monkey Room that Penn and Teller have there that they meet people in, Amber turned to me just as we were about to walk in. She said, "What do these guys do?" And I said, "You haven't seen Penn and Teller?" She says, "No." So she had no idea what they did, and she was kind of quiet during that meeting. And then after we went out and saw the show, she went, "Oh, I wish I knew what they did before I met them because they're wonderful." But
well, I've known Penn and Teller since 1976. Back when they were still a 3-person group.
The Asparagus Valley, whatever it was.
Cultural Society.
Yeah.
And watching their evolution and attendant success has been a great joy. These are not guys who you would necessarily have predicted were going to become as successful as they did, and they did so in part by being true to their own vision. And people who told them, if you're not commercial enough, if you just change this, and they said, no, we're doing what we do. And eventually everyone else turned and agreed with them. So
I saw them when they were playing some little supper club in Westwood that was there briefly in whatever year it was just Penn and Teller at that point. And nobody the audience was interested in them except me. They had an awful lot of stage blood in their act. It was everything was people getting maimed, or the other one of them getting maimed and blood all over the place. And it happened to be one of those places where I think people went hoping to hook up with someone to go home with and didn't care about the entertainment at all. But they were brutally funny, and I really was impressed with them. And I was impressed with how hard they worked, how much they worked.
They still do.
Yeah,
I mean, obviously we're in a different time right now, but during so-called normal times, these are guys who could be coasting. They've got a huge repertoire. They could be coasting for the rest of their lives, the rest of their careers, simply recycling their greatest hits. And instead, they have never stopped developing new things. And I think it's one of the reasons that they can be so damn good.
Yeah, they're quite amazing. And I don't think I've ever been in the Las Vegas airport without seeing one of them rushing to catch a plane. They're always going someplace.
Your story that you are responsible for their show getting picked up reminds me of an old show business anecdote that isn't germane to much of anything, but it does relate to that story, and I'm going to tell it to you whether you want to hear it or not. It has to do with a woman named Spivvy. Does that ring any bells?
No.
All right. You have seen Spivvy in performance once. There was an episode of Alfred Hitchcock Presents back in the late 50s, based on a Roald Dahl short story called Specialty of the House. And the woman who plays the maitre d' of this private club in which the episode takes place is played by Spivvy. Spivvy was a singer in her earlier years, but she became more of an entrepreneur. And in the late 40s into the 50s, she had her own nightclub in New York that was called Spivvy's Rooftop, because it was literally on the roof of a hotel. And it was a very hip place, slightly underground. And there was a guy who got booked for a 3 or 4 week run. And he clicked, and the audience couldn't get enough of him. And some television producers heard about this. Now we're talking the 1950s, and they really liked what they saw, and they said this could translate to television really well. And they went to this young guy and they said, we want to give you a television show, a live television show, several times a week, 15 minutes, but daily or 3 times a week or whatever it was. And he said, that's fantastic. And they said, yeah, here's the catch. We want to start it next week. And the guy said, well, my contract here runs for another week and a half, so I'm not sure I could be available. And they said, well, it's yes or no at this point. So the performer went to Spivvy and said, is there any way I can get out of my contract a week and a half early? And Spivvy said, well, you're drawing really good crowds. I'll tell you what I'll do. The guy who's been contracted to come in after you is based in New York. If he'll come in and start his run early, then I'll let you go and do this TV show. The guy who was booked next was able to come in and start his run early, thus saving this guy and letting him do a TV show. Now I'll fill in the blanks. The guy who came in early to replace the first guy was Jay Marshall, the comedy magician who I mentioned earlier. The guy who was offered the TV show was Liberace. And this was his big break. That was the TV show that then went national and made him a household name. So for the rest of his life, and I was actually, the only time I've ever met Liberace was at an event that Jay was also at. And Jay, I was with Jay, and he strode up to Liberace, said hello, shook his hand, and said, "Lee, don't forget, you owe your career to me," which he said anytime they cross paths. So I think you need to hammer home this point to Penn more forcefully.
Yeah. Well, all right. No, I'm not going to try that anyway. Let's talk about magic on television a bit. When we were booking magicians on That's Incredible, we had a producer who did not like, if you had a 6-minute act, he'd make it cut it to 4 minutes in editing. And I objected occasionally to an edit because in trying to make the thing move faster, he did one or both of two things. He either created a feeling of unreality. You didn't know what had been cut, but there was just something bizarre about the rhythm of the show that made it seem less credible. Or he would cut at the moment when cut out the moment when the magician did the deck switch or did whatever it was, and then a couple other times I had arguments with other directors that I said, you've got to not do an edit in the middle of a magic trick, and you've got to show us with some, if the director is always aware of when the guy's doing the sneaky stuff, whatever it is, and you've got to not cut that out. It's got to be there. So if somebody, because the skill of the magician is to not let the sneaky stuff be obvious. And to a great extent, that's if everybody in the audience spots it, there's no trick. Right. So anyway, and when I was talking with Teller that brief time, we were together maybe 10, 12 minutes or so, I talked about how I thought on one episode of Fool Us, there was a place, and I don't think they did this intentionally, they had cut the part out where where the magician did something that made the trick happen, and he was bothered by that particular one too. It's why we bonded a little bit on that agreement there. When do you think it is okay to edit? When you were on doing those, you were on a lot of those magic specials, they were doing those primetime magic specials. Were you happy with how your work was edited? How it was presented?
Overall, yes.
No, I don't mean by editing. I don't mean just editing, but the camera angles,
generally. Let me answer your question a couple of ways, and I'll start with the fact that magic on television is always going to be not as good as live. Magic on television is sort of the equivalent of pornography. It has its own merits, but it isn't as good as the real thing live. So the minute there's this pane of glass, separating you and the experience, the quality of the magical experience goes down. Because even if it's being done live, there's something in the back of your head as a spectator where you say, they could be getting away with stuff and it wouldn't look as good if I were there.
Okay.
So magic on television starts off at a disadvantage. You would think, therefore, that I would make the next statement being, therefore, you can never do any kind of camera edits or camera cheats. But I don't say that because I think a method is a method. So the question is not, is it moral or ethical to use a camera cut or a specific angle? It's, does it actually work? And that's where we get to what you mentioned, that there are types of edits that feel wrong. And if it feels like a camera cheat, then it's not good. I remember a show, and I'm not going to name names because I'm friends with the people involved, but there was a show back in the 90s that led off with a big illusion that was the height point of the show. I mean, that was what all the advertising was about. And I know the method. I know the person who invented it. I know the performers who were involved in doing it on camera. It was done legit. They didn't do any camera tricks. But it looked like a camera trick. To me, that was a bad trick. The person at home said to themselves, if I'd been there, it wouldn't have looked quite like that. And yet there are other cases, and again, I'm not going to name names, but famous magicians whose names you would know, where I know there were camera tricks used, edits were used, or what have you. And yet it played in such a way that the person watching at home said, yep, if I'd been standing right there, it wouldn't have looked any different. So to me, the good and bad is not based on if the method involves camera tricks or other types of television cheating. It's, did the audience come away from it saying, something was fishy there? Or did they say, boy, that would have looked just like that if they'd done it in my home, or what have you? And there are magicians who disagree vociferously with me and who say any kind of camera cheat or whatever is against the rules. Well, I'm not sure who made those rules. I always like to imagine, as a corollary to this, there was a period in several hundred years ago where most of the magic being performed was being done out on the street. And so the angles were bad from a lot of locations, but there was no one to prevent someone from walking around and looking kind of over the magician's shoulder. So magicians had to deal with bad angles and accommodate them so that they would still fool people. And then at a certain point, let's say in the 1700s or so, some magicians began to move indoors into theaters. And I always imagine that the street magicians of that time were complaining to each other, that's so unfair. That guy gets to go into a theater where, because of the proscenium arch, there are all these angles from which the audience can't view. So he's cheating because we don't get that luxury. And the answer is no, he's not cheating. He or she is making use of the performing space and what it allows and doesn't allow. And that's fair game. Now, having said that, I think most of the time a camera trick, whether it's an outright paint box CGI type of thing, or whether it's an edit or whatever it may be, most of the time such a camera trick is done out of laziness. It's an easy, relatively speaking, an easy and expedient way to get to the magic to work. In part because working for a camera is not the same as working for a human eye. Camera doesn't view things the same as a human eye. And in order to accommodate that difference, cameras don't have selective focus the way that the human eye does. So one way you can get around that problem is through cheating the camera. If it's done out of laziness, then it's almost certainly going to be the situation you described, that you may not know exactly what happened, but you say, something there wasn't right. That wasn't legit. On the other hand, audiences today are very used to the vocabulary of television and film, for that matter. The idea that you watch a live performance, but there's cutting from a close-up to a wide shot, to a specified close-up, to a medium shot, all these different things are ways of accommodating how cameras see things as opposed to how the human eye sees things. And audiences have become so used to that vocabulary that there are moments of cutting from one viewpoint to another, which an audience of, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago would have said, oh, something just happened there, where audiences today say, yep, that's how television works. That's the vocabulary of television. So I'll give you one anecdote. For whatever reason, back in the 1980s, the Japanese networks were really good at editing. I'm not sure whether there's a reason behind that, but they seemed better at editing at least variety entertainment than American networks. And there was I was involved with a number of magic specials in Japan in the 80s, and there was one in particular that was a close-up magic special. And they taped all these acts. It was all taped in Vegas. I was there as the interpreter and advisor. And then when they got all the footage back to Japan, they went through it and they said, okay, for this act, we're only going to use this routine. For this act, we'll start here. And there were two acts specifically where they made significant edits. And one of the acts I won't name because he's still alive, but I'll name the other one because he's not. Johnny Thompson, the great Thompsoni. Johnny had a cups and balls routine that at the time, again, this is back in the 80s, It was very new. It combined many ideas, some of them original with John, some of them very ancient and little known, some of them put together in new formats. And it became a beautiful thing. And very few magicians had seen it because it was so new. And so John performed the routine in this little nightclub setting, and the Japanese recorded it. When they got back to Japan, they said, this thing runs like 8 or 9 minutes. Not good for TV. They chopped out a whole chunk of several minutes, but did so seamlessly so that the edit did not feel abrupt. It just felt like a very normal shift to a different angle. And when the tapes of this, it was shown on Japanese television, it wasn't shown in the United States, but tapes began to circulate among magicians. And Johnny had dozens of magicians, including very well-posted magicians, come up to him and say, I saw that tape of you doing the new cups and balls routine in Japan. You fooled the hell out of me. I missed several of the so-and-sos. Well, they'd missed them because they hadn't existed. They'd been carved out of the video. But even these well-informed magicians didn't realize that there was this huge surgery done because it was done extremely well. And that was true of the other guy whose name I won't mention, but a similar thing where people came and said, boy, your sleight of hand skills have gotten better. And it was because they'd cut out a whole segment. Yeah. So if it's done right, I think it's fair game. The problem is most of the time when editing is used as the means for a magic trick, that's doing it wrong, because it's usually done as an easy way of expediently getting to the result you want. And again, I'm going back to what you said. If the audience feels there's something suspect, if the audience says, no, that's not what it looked like if you were standing there, then even if they don't know what was wrong, and even if nothing wrong was done, even if that's literally a straight through recording that there was no edit, but if the audience feels like there was, then that's bad. Yeah. And if they watch it and it was tinkered with, by ILM or whatever, but the audience says, if I had been standing there, it would have looked that way, then you've done it right.
It used to bother me when I was watching, when I was 8 or 9, whatever I was, watching the Magic Land of Alakazam. I think I was about 9. That Mark Wilson would do these tricks, and then he did commercials for Kellogg's during the spot. And during the commercials, they would do cuts and make things appear with camera magic. And I thought that's cheapening. I knew what they were doing, and I thought that's cheapening the magic. Well, and I made the same comment about on Penn and Teller's show. They do a little package before each magician comes out where he's explaining who he is, and they film on location or whatever, and they put camera tricks in there. Things the guys never did on stage.
I talked about this with Penn and Teller, or for that matter, I don't recall talking about it with Mark, but I'm sure in both cases, their feeling is the advertising segments are sort of outside of the contract. A lot of times you'll hear television magicians refer to, there's a contract between the magician and the audience saying, we will not use camera tricks. I don't believe that contract exists. My stuff doesn't depend on camera tricks. So this isn't about whether I walk the walk or not. It's moot. But in terms of judging other magicians on TV, for me, camera tricks are not an issue. I get that for some magicians they are. And again, that's because bad camera tricks pollute the pool for everyone.
Okay, but don't they cheapen? When Mark Wilson can make the box of Kellogg cereals appear just by clicking his fingers, and then then later on he's doing a trick where he makes a person disappear legitimately. Doesn't one trivialize the other?
Presumption, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but I think there's at least a presumption that the audience understands that the rules apply during the one and not the other. And
the audience for Mark Wilson was 8 years old.
I know. When you were 8, could you not?
I figured it out, but
trick?
I always figure there's people in this world dumber than me and smarter than me. but whatever age I am,
there are people who think that any magic on TV, with or without camera tricks, is actually demonology in action. And if you
Yeah.
don't
Okay.
feel that, spend a little time on
All right.
Facebook or YouTube and look at the comment section.
All
So,
right.
so this, in a way, this relates to. I don't think you've ever been directly involved in soap operas.
Not really. No, I developed one once, but we never produced it. Yeah.
Every actor who's ever been on a soap opera for any length of time. I was on General Hospital for 2 episodes, which wasn't long enough to have this experience I'm about to describe. But any actor who's had a long-term part on a television soap opera, he or she will tell you that they've had the experience of walking down the street and someone comes running up to them and says, "Your wife is cheating on you."
Yeah.
Because there are people who don't understand the concept of fiction and
Oh,
story.
yeah. No, that's true. I mean, I had one time, I actually had an office at ABC next door to the guy who was playing the lead doctor on General Hospital, and we shared a phone line, and I got a lot of his calls, and people were phoning him from Wichita to ask him advice.
On,
and he would
medical symptoms?
on medical, on like, what do I do with my life and things like that, because he seemed like such a good authority figure on the soap opera. I understand that, but if the magic, I have never seen you on television do anything that I could not see you do right in front of me at the castle or in the theater. All right. What if the television was creating something, an effect that you could not do live? And I'm thinking now of how in the David Copperfield special era, it was like every magic special had to have that one spectacular trick that no one had ever done before. Tune in, he's going to make Utah disappear, or whatever the bad trick was.
Right.
And frequently, those kind of fudged the edge of what was, to me, legitimate by saying, for example, this shot will not cut away. No, but it's not going to pan 3 inches to the left either.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Again,
because
again, okay, with, a magician is going to take advantage of the conditions that he or she has to work with. And if television allows for something involving forced perspective, let's say, that doesn't work with a live audience, I don't think that's out of bounds. It's only out of bounds if the audience says, I don't buy this. I don't believe that this is really happening the way it would in a live show. Now,
okay. Now, right, but
strongly disagree with what I'm saying here.
Okay, but okay. Let's say you're doing this is not the type of trick you do, but you're doing a big, huge trick on a magic show, a live magic show, and you bring people up from the audience and you say, "Have you people ever met me before?" No, you're all from the audience, and they're all paid plans.
Right.
Is that legit to do?
Well, again, I would say the same thing. Those are normally called stooges, is the industry term most often. And I have no moral issue with stooges. The problem I have with stooges is, first of all, it's not a very practical method. Certainly not if you're doing it in live shows, because then you'd have to, there are only 2 types of stooges. I don't use either, but there are only 2 types of stooges. One is something who does something incredibly simple. They're asked to name a number and you've told them in advance to pick the number 7. Mm-hmm. There are ways around that some skill and knowledge will accommodate. So that kind of stooge, there's no real excuse for. And then the other type is a stooge who does something very complicated, which means basically for most circumstances, you'd have to keep changing stooges because it takes a while to train someone to do that in a complicated way. And how practical is that if you're on the road? That you'd have to, travel with 15 people in order to have one different stooge every night. So stooging, I think, is overall not a very practical method. And it's also most of the time, almost all the time, stooging is a sign of laziness. It's an easy method, technically. If you have a stooge who goes along with all the things you've told them in advance, then kind of anybody could do it. And I think that translates to the audience. Again, it feels off.
So you're saying it's not good magic, but it is not necessarily dishonest.
Look, all magic by its very nature is dishonest. All art is dishonest. All art is deception. magic is the form of art that puts that deception up in front. But, you know, a painting of a tree is art because it's not a tree.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's a rendering that makes you feel like you're experiencing a tree.
Mm-hmm.
Art is by definition deception. And so magic is the same, except that in magic, the deception is kind of what's being promoted up front. As such, it's all cheating. So we're now going to kind of micro examine what kind of cheating is fair cheating and what kind of cheating is unfair cheating. It's cheating.
I think there is fair cheating and there is unfair cheating.
Well,
okay.
And there was a time
I think it's perfectly legitimate.
I agreed with you.
Okay.
And I don't particularly like the use of stooges or the use of camera tricks. But the reason I don't like them is not because I consider them to be immoral or unethical. It's because they are almost always lazy and therefore inferior to finding better ways to accomplish these things, because they almost always betray themselves in that the home viewer, you know, you mentioned earlier about how the director's in on everything. Mm-hmm. Not when they work with me. When I do television shows, and people are stunned when they hear this, but when I do TV shows, I refuse to do full rehearsals. I will say to the director, I'll show you where things are going to happen.
Okay.
There won't be any surprises. There's not going to be a sudden bouquet of flowers or birds flying out of something. But I don't want to run through everything, because I'd rather have an imperfection in the way it's recorded than have it seem so pat that the audience can imagine, oh, it was all set up. Because my work, given that it's mostly in the form of mind reading, everything I do can be basically torn apart if someone says it's stooges. If someone sees me perform something with someone and they say, well, he set it up with that person, then it's over. So one of the things that I do to try to counter that is I want that person, and that includes if it's the host of the show, all the more. I want that person to not know what I'm going to be doing until we have it being done in front of the camera, so that when that person reacts, it has the ring of truth. They are genuinely shocked or surprised or weirded out or whatever the reaction may be. And this is going to say far more than if I were to stand on at the outset and say, take my word for it, no stooges. Because people say, but I don't know whether to believe you, but they'll believe their own sense of it. And the interesting thing, and then I'll get off this soapbox, but the interesting thing is I've been working this way for decades. And I won't say I've never rehearsed something. There have been some circumstances which have been elaborate enough that I've gone a little further. I will say I never take the director or anybody into my confidence, whereas most magicians will say, let me break this down for you exactly so we know what to avoid. I don't. And as I say, most of the time I don't actually do a full rehearsal. I will simply do the blocking. The directors from whom I get the most resistance to this idea are on Good Morning Podunk. You know, directors on some morning show or afternoon chat show or whatever that has a viewing audience of 50,000 people. That's the director who's going to say, no, I can't. That's unprofessional.
But that director is doing the show, airing the show live.
Well, but even the live shows that I've done in other places where it's been on a network, I've been out on network shows on live TV. I was on a CBS primetime show, maybe the last one they've ever done as far as a live entertainment show, back in the mid 80s. It was hosted by Dick Clark. It was a Dick Clark summer series. That whole show was done live to the East Coast, and it was on tape delay to the West Coast, but they didn't change anything between the original live airing and the later airing. And I was asked by the producer who I'd worked with before, pitch me something. He said, we're doing this new variety series. What would you do if I put you on the first episode? So I pitched something. He said, that sounds great. How long does it run? And I said, how long do you want it to run? And he said, oh, I forgot I'm talking to Max. You'll make it whatever length we want, which is about the nicest thing a producer's ever said to me. So now we did do a couple of run-throughs where I walked through the effect. And it came in solidly at 3 minutes and 45 seconds within a couple of seconds, both run-throughs. And they said, that's perfect, we're happy. Now we get to the live show. I'm standing backstage. I'm going to be introduced in about a minute. Vanessa Williams is finishing her song, and then Dick Clark in the audience is going to have a little banter with Reba McEntire, and then he's going to throw to me. And with literally about a minute before I walk on stage live, someone comes running up to me from the booth and says, Max, we're running 10 seconds over. Can you make it up for us? And I said, sure. And somewhere in my endless piles of papers and boxes full of papers, I have a note from Dick Clark thanking me because I saved him 20 seconds. That's live television, my friend.
Yeah, no, I worked with Dick Clark, and I worked with him on live television.
Yeah,
and
so you don't get retakes, and you just have to be aware of every moment counts.
Okay, all right. I think you know how to talk to the directors better than some magicians, maybe.
Maybe.
No, I'm going to wrap this up here in a minute here, but what strikes me here is that one of the topics which I don't want to get into here now because it's too. We'll be here another hour if I do it. Right. It always amuses me that when I'm in the audience, magician does a fabulous trick. I'll give you an example. David Copperfield on his live show does this thing where he's on one side of a steel wall and then he's on another side of the steel wall. And behind me, I overheard. I met Copperfield after the show. I told him this, and he got hysterical. I heard some lady say to her boyfriend, "How does he do that? How's that done?" And the guy says, "Oh, they've used what it is it's unstable molecules that are frozen. And he's got a blowtorch, and he melts them so he can pass through them, and then they heal up. So he has invented. When I went to see Penn and Teller one time when Penn was still doing his fire eating act. Yeah. I heard something about saying, "Oh, that's done with cold fire. Yeah, it's a chemical that looks like fire, but it doesn't burn." And I think to myself, here these guys did a really clever trick, and someone is dismissing it with a funny. And it bothers me that when you do one of your acts, which if I haven't made it clear, I think you are phenomenal on stage, and I love the commanding presence you have, and I love the way the audience goes out. They just surrender to you. You come out with such credibility, and the people just love the act, and we'll follow him anywhere we go. And there's going to be some guy who's going to go out there and going, it was all prearranged with stooges in the audience. Somebody's going to say that. And I think that saying, we're not using stooges ought to have some credibility. Well, and let me say one other point. Yeah. If you look if you go, when Penn and Teller Foolish puts a trick on, you go to YouTube videos, and there's for everyone, there's 1,000 comments on how it was done and such. And one of the points that people make is because Penn has said frequently on the show, and I think enough people have caught it, we never allow stooges. We monitor the magicians, right, and we never allow pre-show work. Mm-hmm. So someone says, "Oh, this guy was a plant," and then someone says, "No, we trust in the integrity of that show. They don't use stooges."
But that is based in part that Penn and Teller have built up a relationship with their viewing audience, that when they say that to their normal viewing audience, the viewing audience says, "I believe you."
Okay.
But there are still going to be people who see an episode of Penn and Teller, and despite that statement, "We don't allow stooges," they're going to walk away saying, "Yeah, but it was stooges. They just lied." And there's a point past which you can't carry that around. There are going to be people who analyze my work, or Penn and Teller, David Copperfield, whoever, and come to ludicrous conclusions, whether it's metal that you can melt through, or, when David Copperfield, there was a period he was doing a thing that was simply referred to as flying, which may be the greatest levitation ever performed. He was levitating himself, but he was going all over the stage in different positions, and any thoughts you might have had that there were hidden wires or something were all discounted. And I saw people apparently with good educations writing online, it's electromagnets. He's just got these incredibly powerful electromagnets. Ultimately, there are people who are going to go there, and there's an old expression that magicians have attempted to get to catch on with the public. I associate it with Horace Golden back in the early 20th century, but it's probably older. But the phrase is, it's fun to be fooled. And I think it can be fun to be fooled, but it's not fun to be made to feel a fool. And unfortunately, a lot of audiences wind up feeling adversarial with magicians. And this is in many cases, not every, but in many cases, this is as much, if not more, the fault of the magician than it is of the audience, because magicians frequently will be combative. See if you can catch me. And so it becomes this sort of adversarial game in which the magic becomes more of a puzzle or a riddle than a mystery. And as I have said on other occasions, I think there are two types of mysteries. Ones that are meant to be solved and ones that are meant to be savored. And I'm working in the second camp.
Yeah.
That's what I'm going for.
Yeah.
You'll never get everybody. There are people who are have such a bad relationship to the idea of not knowing something, of being fooled by a secret, that becomes their sole focus, is trying to figure that out. And they kind of lose any opportunity to get anything out of the experience other than a challenge, a puzzle. I feel sorry for those people. I'm going to do the best I can in my work to try and encourage a different relationship, a different reaction to what I do, so that maybe I can minimize the number of people who have that. But the notion that I'll get rid of them all, that I'll never have a spectator whose entire reaction to things that I've worked on for half a century is, I think I can work out a way to duplicate that. And I have to accept that. I suppose there are chefs who create gourmet meals, and there's someone who just doesn't like, there are certain foods I don't care for. All right. I'm not big on oysters. There are people who live for oysters, but I don't care for them. So the chef who makes the greatest oysters in the world has failed with me. As far as I know, I've yet to find a chef who made an oyster dish where I said, oh, I've completely changed my mind. And he's going to have to live, he or she is going to have to live with the fact that I'm the customer who doesn't like oysters. I'll find something, hopefully, on that same chef's menu that I do like. And I hope that whoever is watching my show, if they find something to be an annoying puzzle that they're going to brood over, that they'll at least find some other experiences within what I'm delivering that they can appreciate and enjoy. If they say, I have suspicions about how he did the magic stuff, but he was a good storyteller. He made me laugh a few times. Well, it's not the ideal reaction, but I'll take it.
Yeah. Okay, Max, I agree. We're getting to a good point here to wind this down here. By the way, there are chefs in this world who make only foods that I cannot eat because of my food allergies, and the Magic Castle has hired every one of them. So, anyway, before we go, Professor, would you tell us a little bit about? Oh, I was also going to mention one time I saw a magician once in Vegas who used more stooges than Ted Healy. So, all right.
Good luck.
Tell us about what you're doing these days. You're lecturing?
Well, I am doing stuff these days mostly for magicians. I've done some lectures, both lectures about how to do certain tricks, but also some historical lectures. And I've also got some new products that are being marketed in the way of video downloads. I will say, however, that these are things that the people watching this who are magicians, they know how to find out about them. So I want to say something different instead. I want to plug something different, if I may.
All right.
We started off, you were talking about the Magic Castle. Last March 28th, I became the vice president of the Magic Castle. of the Academy of Magical Arts, which has its clubhouse in the Magic Castle, as it were, which was 2 weeks.
I voted for you. I voted for you.
Well,
right.
I became vice president 2 weeks after the club shuttered because of the COVID shutdown. So it's been a very strange experience being the vice president of a club that isn't actually running. However, we are doing things, and some of those things are only for members. We've been having a lot of online content for members of the Magic Castle. And we've also had other types of programs. But there are two things that we've got going that are open to non-members. So I want to plug those instead of plugging something I'm doing. First of all, a little over a week ago, we had the 52nd annual award show of the Academy of Magical Arts, which for the first time, and for obvious reasons, was a virtual show. It was done online. It's free, it's still available. And if you are interested in spending 55 minutes watching some nice people with some glimpses of magic and largely magicians congratulating each other, but it's a warm show. And if you're interested, you can see it by going to www.magiccastle.com/awards. And that will take you to an on-demand video, a Vimeo location, and you can watch the show. It's under an hour.
It's very good show. I saw it. Right? Yes.
The other thing is we've been doing a program in 2 parts called Dine and Delight. And what that means is we're serving food. You order it the day before, you come by and pick it up. It's all been worked out so that it's gourmet food at a very low price, that you make your order, pick it up the next day, all done under the safest conditions. And that's Wednesdays through Sundays. And if you go to the Magic Castle homepage, which is magiccastle.com, you'll be able to click and learn more about Dine and Delight and make an order if you live in the area of Hollywood and get some food. As an add-on to that, and then I'm done plugging, we've got a new program, which is we have a dinner show every Saturday night at 7 o'clock. There is a magic show with 3 performers. It's online. If you're a member of the AMA, you get in for free. If you're not a member of the AMA, there are 2 ways to go about it. One is to order more than $50 worth of food from this Dine and Delight program. And if you do that, and if you're ordering for two or more people, it's going to be over $50. Then you get a free ticket to watch the virtual show. The other way is to buy a ticket, and it's $20 per household. And you can get them either by going online, or you can find them online through Gold Star. And it's a different lineup every week, every Saturday. And people like them because there are some good people doing magic on those shows. So that's what I want to plug. If anybody is a magician and wants to find out what I'm marketing or lecturing about, you know where to look.
Before we go, I want to thank Holly Buchanan, who's been helping us here with notes from the chat room. And she writes, I have occasionally shown a Max clip twice to a class, once just to enjoy it and once to recognize the algebra underlying it. That's almost always fun both times. Very impressive.
I'll accept the almost, Holly, but thank you for the kind word.
I also had this thought that the reason you're vice president is that you counted the ballots and you went like this. When they came in, they went, this is a vote for me. This is a vote for me. This is a vote for me. Anyway.
The real question now is, were you just doing an impression of Johnny Carson or Steve Allen?
Well, Johnny Carson used to do impressions of Steve Allen all the time. So anyway, this is the longest one of these I've ever done, and we could go another hour, but I need to use the restroom, and you probably do too.
As has been the case in our past conversations that haven't been online, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, Mark. You have a wealth of knowledge and great stories of your own, and you ask good questions.
Thank you. Well, you're a very fine interviewer. I've watched you interview some wonderful people. One of my favorite moments at the castle was we had dinner with James Randi, and then we went so that you interview him one night. And it was, that's a wonderful discussion.
I did 2 lengthy interviews with James Randi in front of live audiences. You can find them both online.
Yeah. Well, anyway, as you can see, folks, we don't really like each other very much. So there we go. This show will repeat repeatedly on demand in the same space you're watching it now. If you came in late, it will be online for a long time. And I have some interesting people lined up for future conversations like this. It's going to be tough to top Max Maven. Thank you, Max, and thank you all for watching.
Great talking to you.